May 22nd, 1974. It was a Wednesday evening in Jacksonville, Florida, and Freddie Farah was working late at the Grand Park food store on Kings Road. At 34 years old, Freddie was a devoted father to 4 young children and a hardworking entrepreneur who had built his small grocery store from the ground up. His wife and kids were waiting for him at home, expecting him to return after closing up for the night. He would never make it home. Around closing time, a teenage customer walked into the store carrying a box of cake mix and a can of frosting. The young man approached the counter where Freddie stood. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The customer pulled out a gun and demanded money. Freddie, startled by the sudden threat, instinctively swiped at the weapon. A single gunshot echoed through the small store. Freddie collapsed behind the counter, shot in the head. The robber fled into the night, leaving behind the cake mix, the frosting can, and a father of 4, bleeding on the floor of his own store. Freddie's uncle had been in the store during the robbery, but he only looked up after hearing the shots fired. All he saw was the shooter's back as he ran away. There was one other witness, a 14-year-old girl who had been in the store shopping. She saw everything. Jacksonville Sheriff's Office detectives worked the case immediately, lifting fingerprints from the abandoned items on the counter, the cake mix box, the frosting can, and a soda can. But in 1974, fingerprint technology was limited. Without a suspect to match the prints to, without a clear identification, the case went cold. Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years. For the Farah family, life would never be the same. Freddie's widow was left to raise 4 children alone. She went back to college to better provide for her family, showing extraordinary strength in the face of unimaginable loss. The 3 daughters and 1 son, some so young they would barely remember their father, grew up without the man who had loved and provided for them. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, all stolen memories, all moments Freddie would never experience. Bobby Farah, Freddie's son, carried the weight of his father's unsolved murder throughout his life. "I've always had this feeling that someone was out there that was responsible, and I wanted to find out who that person could be," he would later say. The case file sat in the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office archives for decades. 43 years passed. The world changed. Technology advanced. The cold case unit periodically reviewed old cases, but the Freddie Farah murder remained unsolved, the oldest cold case in Jacksonville Sheriff's Office history. Then came a chance encounter that would change everything. Bobby Farah was out grabbing a bite to eat one day when he happened to bump into a cold case detective. They struck up a conversation. Bobby mentioned his father's case, the murder that had haunted his family for more than 4 decades. The detective's interest was piqued. Perhaps it was time to take another look at the Freddie Farah case. In December 2016, the cold case unit pulled the file and began a fresh review. Advances in fingerprint database technology had revolutionized criminal investigations since 1974. The prints that had been lifted from the cake mix box and frosting can 43 years earlier were still preserved in the evidence file. Detectives submitted them through modern databases, searching for a match that earlier technology couldn't have found. This time, they got a hit. The fingerprints belonged to a man named Johnny Lewis Miller. In 1974, Miller had just been 17 years old and living in Jacksonville. Now he was 60 years old and living in New Orleans, where he had moved in the early 1990s. But finding Miller's name was only the first step. Detectives needed to locate him. They discovered Miller had recently been evicted from his last known address. The trail seemed to be going cold again. But then investigators learned something interesting. Miller might be working as a street performer somewhere in downtown New Orleans. Jacksonville detectives contacted the New Orleans Police Department. They described Miller to a police officer who patrolled the French Quarter. The officer immediately recognized the description. He said, "I know exactly who you're talking about. Miller was a well-known fixture in the French Quarter, where he had performed as a human statue for more than 2 decades. People knew him as Uncle Louis. Tourists frequently stopped to take pictures with him and his miniature stuffed dog, Little Willie. Within hours, New Orleans police had Miller in custody. On May 16, 2017, Jacksonville Sheriff Mike Williams held a news conference to announce the arrest. The Farah family, Freddie's widow, his son Bobby, and his 3 daughters stood together as Sheriff Williams explained how the oldest cold case in JSO history was finally solved. "We're relieved," Bobby Farah told the assembled media. "Some of us never thought we'd see this day." The evidence was compelling. Detectives had tracked down the surviving witness, the girl who had been 14 years old in 1974 and was now 57 years old and living out of state. Annette Bryant Williams provided valuable information about what she had witnessed that night. She recalled what the shooter looked like and how he had placed items on the counter before pulling the gun. Her testimony would be crucial, the only thing that could definitively link Miller's fingerprints to the murder. The case seemed solid. Justice, delayed for 43 years, finally seemed within reach. Miller was extradited from New Orleans to Jacksonville. He was charged with second-degree murder and attempted armed robbery. The family prepared themselves for a trial, ready to face the man who had taken Freddie from them and robbed them of 43 years with a husband, father, and grandfather. Then, tragedy struck again. In December 2017, Annette Bryant Williams died unexpectedly. She was 58 years old. Her death came just 1 month before her scheduled deposition, 1 month before her testimony could legally be preserved. The timing was devastating for the prosecution's case. Without Williams' testimony, the statements she had given to detectives would not be admissible at trial. State Attorney Melissa Nelson faced a difficult reality. The fingerprint evidence alone wasn't enough without a witness who could place Miller in the store at the time of the murder. The case that had seemed so strong was now riddled with legal holes. But the Farah family didn't want the case dropped. After 43 years of waiting, they needed Miller to admit what he had done. They needed him to acknowledge the pain he had caused, the lives he had destroyed. Prosecutors and Miller's defense attorney negotiated a plea deal. It was unusual, perhaps even controversial. Miller would plead guilty to second-degree murder. In exchange, he would be sentenced to time served, 344 days he had already spent in the Duval County Jail. On April 25, 2018, 44 years after Freddie Farah was shot and killed in his own store, Johnny Lewis Miller stood before Judge Angela Cox and admitted his guilt. The Farah children read victim impact statements. Christine, who had been just 5 years old when her father was killed, spoke about growing up without him. "There are no words that can convey the sense of loss I felt that day," she said. To this day, she wondered if her father would have been proud of her accomplishments, milestones he never got to witness. Judge Cox called the arrangement unusual, but praised the family's decision to meet with the perpetrator. "It speaks volumes to me that your family took the opportunity to do that," she said. The meeting between victim and perpetrator offered what Cox called a rare opportunity for healing. Miller became a free man that Wednesday in April. As he left the courtroom, he mouthed the words, "Thank you," to the Farah family. Bobby Farah responded with a thumbs up, a gesture that spoke to the complicated nature of the closure they had achieved. It wasn't the ending many had hoped for when Miller was arrested. After 43 years of waiting, the killer would serve less than a year behind bars. But for the Farah family, what mattered most was that Miller had finally admitted his guilt. He had acknowledged what he did on that May evening in 1974 when he walked into a grocery store with cake mix and frosting, pulled out a gun, and destroyed a family. State Attorney Melissa Nelson understood the family's perspective. "It was important to this family that he admit his guilt," she explained. "It was important for them to hear." The case became so significant that it was featured on the true crime series Cold Case Files on Hulu in 2024. The episode highlighted not just the crime itself, but the chance encounter between Bobby Farah and that cold case detective. The conversation that brought the case back to life after more than 4 decades. Today, the Grand Park food store is long gone, but the memory of Freddie Farah lives on through his children, his grandchildren he never met, and a case that reminds us that sometimes justice doesn't arrive on our timeline, but when it does arrive, even 43 years late, it can bring a measure of peace to those who have waited, hoped, and never given up. May 16, 1998, in the Diamond Heights neighborhood of San Francisco, Lisa Valdez was hosting a small dinner party in her studio apartment. Her mother Helen was there, along with her mom's boyfriend and a few other guests. The evening was filled with laughter, good food, and the warmth that seemed to radiate from Lisa wherever she went. At 36 years old, she was a successful computer programmer with an infectious personality that lit up every room she entered. Helen stayed until around midnight, then said goodnight to her daughter. It would be the last time she would ever see Lisa alive. The next day, May 17th, Lisa was supposed to attend her regular dance class. Dancing was one of her passions. She and her best friend, Lisa Robinson, had bonded over their love of movement since they were 15 years old. Their names even rhymed, and their friendship felt like destiny. But that Sunday, Lisa didn't show up to class. That wasn't like her at all. Days passed. Lisa didn't come to work. Phone calls went unanswered. On May 20th, the building manager noticed a terrible smell coming from one of the units. When police entered Lisa's apartment, they found a scene of horrific violence. Lisa's body lay on the floor in an advanced state of decomposition. She had been stabbed more than 20 times in her upper body and face. Her hands showed defensive wounds. She had fought desperately against her attacker. Blood covered the mattress and pillows, evidence of a frenzied assault. And there was something particularly disturbing. Lisa's waist-length hair, which Helen said was her daughter's pride and joy, had been cut off. The killer had apparently taken it as a trophy. Because of the decomposition, medical examiners couldn't determine if sexual assault had occurred, but the brutality of the attack suggested rage, passion, or both. This wasn't a random burglary gone wrong. This was personal. San Francisco police investigators immediately began pursuing leads. They collected DNA from the bloody crime scene and lifted 2 partial fingerprints from the toilet seat. They interviewed Lisa's co-workers, friends, and family members. An answering machine message pointed them toward a co-worker who had expressed romantic interest in Lisa, but his DNA didn't match. The fingerprints cleared him as well. Every male friend and family member provided DNA samples. None matched. Detectives explored every angle, followed every lead, but each one seemed to hit a dead end. Without a match in the DNA database, without a clear suspect, the case eventually went cold. For Lisa Robinson, Lisa's best friend since adolescence, the loss was devastating. She described Lisa as someone who was faithful and loyal before those concepts became fashionable catchphrases. When Lisa was your friend, she was all in. The two had shared dreams, secrets, and countless hours on dance floors together. After Lisa's murder, Lisa felt like she had fallen into darkness herself. She expected the world to stop turning, but of course it didn't. Life continued around her while she struggled to process the violent end of someone so full of light and energy. Years passed. The case file sat in the cold case unit. But there was one person who refused to let Lisa Valdez become just another forgotten victim gathering dust in the archives. Her name was Pam Hofsass, a forensic analyst with the San Francisco Police Department. Hofsass had been with the case from the very beginning, back in 1998, when Lisa's body was first discovered. Over the years, as forensic technology advanced, Hofsass remained vigilant. She had a protocol that she followed for all her cases. Every single year, she would resubmit DNA evidence to see if new technology or new entries in the database might yield a match. Year after year, she submitted Lisa's case evidence. Year after year, no match appeared. But Hofsass never gave up. She knew that DNA databases were constantly growing, constantly being updated with new offenders. All it would take was one hit, one match, and everything could change. In early September 2011, 13 years after Lisa's murder, that moment finally arrived. The DNA profile from the bloody crime scene matched a man in the national database named Anthony Quinn Hughes. He was 52 years old, living right there in San Francisco. The match came after Hughes had been arrested on a shoplifting charge, which required a DNA swab. His profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, and the computer found what human investigators had been unable to discover for over a decade. Even more compelling, Hughes's fingerprints matched the partial prints lifted from Lisa's toilet seat. His middle finger was a perfect match. On September 10, 2011, San Francisco officers spotted Hughes jaywalking in the Tenderloin neighborhood, right at the corner of Leavenworth and Turk Streets. They recognized him from his mugshot and immediately took him into custody. When detectives brought Hughes in for questioning, they initially framed their interview as if they were investigating a series of burglaries in the area around Lisa's apartment complex. Hughes seemed relatively calm. But when Lisa Valdez's name came up, everything changed. Hughes became agitated, defensive. He initially denied even knowing Lisa, but when pressed, he eventually admitted that they had known each other in high school. In fact, they had dated when they were teenagers. He claimed he had bumped into her once in the 1980s, but insisted he had never been in her apartment. The detectives didn't believe him. The DNA evidence said otherwise. The fingerprints said otherwise. Then Hughes said something that shocked the investigators in the room. He looked at them and asked, "You think that I killed Lisa?" Detective Schudleis later recalled what happened next. It looked like Hughes was about to write out a confession. He asked for something to write with. The officers handed him a pen, expecting him to begin putting his admission on paper. Instead, Hughes began repeatedly stabbing himself in the chest and neck with the pen. Officers had to wrestle him into submission to stop the self-inflicted violence. It was a moment that suggested guilt, desperation, or both. Hughes was charged with Lisa Valdez's murder. Investigators believed he'd stayed with her body for more than a day after killing her before finally fleeing the scene. They theorized that Hughes, perhaps a former high school sweetheart who had carried a torch for Lisa all those years, had become enraged when she rejected his advances. The cut hair suggested he wanted to keep a piece of her, a twisted trophy from someone he had once loved. The case went to trial in December 2015. The evidence was compelling. DNA, fingerprints, Hughes's own admission that he knew the victim, and his bizarre self-harm episode during interrogation. The following month, the jury returned with a first-degree murder conviction. However, in an unusual turn, the judge reduced the conviction to second-degree murder at sentencing. A mistrial was declared on the attempted rape charge. In 2016, Anthony Quinn Hughes was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. He continues to maintain his innocence, claiming he has been wrongly accused. For Lisa Robinson, the conviction brought a measure of peace after years of darkness. She attended the sentencing and spoke about the light that Lisa had brought to the world, a light that was extinguished in such a violent and unnecessary way. Robinson also wanted to highlight something important in the midst of the case's resolution. At a time when tensions between police and communities were high, she wanted people to know about the angels working within law enforcement. She specifically praised Pam Hofsass, calling her her angel for testing DNA evidence from Lisa's crime scene every single year without fail. Hofsass, in her characteristically humble way, explained that this was simply what she did for all her cases. She remembered Lisa as someone who was outgoing and loving, a joy to be around, according to all reports. It was so unnecessary to have her suffer in that manner, Hofsass said. The case became so significant that it was featured multiple times on true crime programs.
including an episode of Cold Case Files in 2021 titled Devil at the Door, and on Oxygen's In Ice Cold Blood. The story resonated with audiences not just because of the horrific crime, but because of the dedication that solved it. Pam Hofsass's yearly persistence represented something larger than one case or one victim. It represented a commitment to the idea that every victim matters, that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that sometimes the most important work happens quietly, consistently, year after year in a forensic laboratory. Lisa Valdez loved to dance. She loved her friends fiercely. She worked hard and lived fully. She deserved to grow old, to continue lighting up rooms with her energy, to dance for many more years. Instead, she was taken violently at 36 years old by someone from her past who couldn't accept rejection. But 13 years later, thanks to advancing technology and one forensic analyst who refused to give up, Lisa got justice. Anthony Quinn Hughes became eligible for parole in 2024. He remains incarcerated at the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton. Whether he will ever be released remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: Lisa Valdez is not forgotten. Her light may have been extinguished, but the memory of who she was and the dedication of those who fought for her justice continues to shine.